They said her father sold her for being too fat, too dark, and too quiet, traded her to a ghost of a man on a snowy mountain ridge for a rifle that was probably more rust than steel, an unwanted daughter for a useless gun. That was the story they whispered back in town. A fair trade, they'd say, but the whispers were wrong. All of them. The truth was 100 times worse, and buried a whole lot deeper than a winter snow. What was about to unfold in that lonely cabin high in the Wind River Range wasn't just a story of survival, it was a story of secrets. And the first secret was that the man who took her wasn't just some mountain hermit, and she wasn't just some girl. The cold was a living thing. It bit through Junior Berk's threadbare dress, chewed at her bones, and made the quilt around her shoulders feel like a single sheet of paper. She was 14 years old, perched on the buckboard of a wagon being pulled by a mule that looked as tired as she felt. Every lurch of the wheel on the frozen trail was a reminder of where she was going. Away. Beside her, her father, Tom Lark, was a block of cold fury. His knuckles were white on the reins, his jaw set so tight she thought his teeth might crack. They hadn't spoken in 2 days, not since she'd heard him by the campfire, his voice thick with cheap whiskey, muttering to the flames. Too dark, he'd slurred. Too big. Can't marry her off. Can't feed her. Just another mouth. Each word had been a stone thrown at her heart. She looked at her hands folded in her lap. They were brown and strong. Her mother's hands. Nothing like her father's pale, bony fingers. She had her mother's broad shoulders, her mother's dark eyes, her mother's silence. And since her mother's passing, it seemed her father hated her for every piece of the woman he'd lost. The mule stumbled, and Tom let out a curse that seemed to freeze in the air. The trail was getting steeper, narrower. The pines closed in around them, their branches heavy with snow. It felt like the world was shrinking, squeezing them towards some terrible end. And then she saw him. He was standing in the middle of the trail, as if he'd grown right out of the frozen earth. He was huge, a mountain of a man in a heavy wool coat, a rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. His face was all beard and shadow under the brim of a wide hat, but his eyes were sharp. They watched the wagon approach without a flicker of emotion. Tom pulled the mule to a halt. The silence that fell was heavier than the snow. "You cross." Tom's voice was a gravelly rasp. The mountain man gave a nod so small it was barely there. His gaze slid from Tom to Junior, lingered for a half second, then moved back. There was no pity in his eyes, no curiosity, nothing. It was like being looked at by a boulder. "Got one for you," Tom said, jerking a thumb toward Junior. "Girl's strong, good for work, but her color, her size, ain't no man in town gonna take her." The world stopped. The wind died. The mule's breath hung in the air. Junior's own breath caught in her throat, a knot of ice and panic. This was it. This was happening. He was trading her. He was leaving her here. The man, Luther Cross, didn't respond. He just stared at Tom, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched on, pulled thin and tight like a wire. Junior wanted to scream, to run, to beg, but the shame was a physical weight, pressing her down, stealing her voice. Finally, Luther spoke. His voice was low, like rocks grinding together deep underground. "What's the price?" Tom didn't even haggle. He reached into the back of the wagon and pulled out the old rifle. The one with the cracked stock and the rusted barrel. He held it out. "This'll do." The exchange was over in a heartbeat. The rifle passed from Tom's hand to Luther's. Her father was already turning away, climbing back onto the wagon seat without a single look back. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't say her name. He just slapped the reins, and the mule began its slow, limping journey back down the mountain, leaving her behind. Luther Cross stood there for a long moment, just watching the wagon disappear. Then he moved. It was a careful, deliberate motion, like a man used to dealing with spooked animals. He shrugged off his heavy wool coat and held it out to her. Junior stared at it, then at the empty trail where her father had been. Her whole life, gone. Everything she had ever known, vanished around a snowy bend in the road. With hands that shook so badly she could barely control them, she took the coat. It was heavy and smelled of pine smoke and winter. It was the warmest thing she had ever felt. "Cabin's up ahead," Luther's voice rumbled. "Night's coming on." She followed him. Her feet moved, but her mind was a whirlwind of shock and pain. Sold. For a broken gun. Her own father. The word echoed in her head, a hammer blow with every step. Unwanted. 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 The cabin was made of solid, dark logs with a stone chimney, puffing a lazy curl of smoke into the twilight sky. It looked strong. Permanent. Inside, a fire crackled in a large hearth. Luther pointed to a small adjoining room. There was a narrow bed inside with a simple quilt. He didn't say another word, just left her there, closing the door softly behind him. She didn't take off the coat. She curled up on the bed, pulling it tight around her, as if it could somehow hold the shattered pieces of hers together. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't make a sound. Crying was a weakness her father had never tolerated. Through the thin wall, she could hear Luther moving about. The clink of a pot, the sound of wood being added to the fire, the steady, quiet rhythm of a life she was now a part of. But it wasn't a comfort, it was terrifying. She thought of her mother's words, a faint memory from a time when she'd felt loved. "You have the strength of mountains in your blood, little one. Never forget that." But tonight, she felt as small and fragile as a single snowflake, lost in a storm she couldn't see the end of. She was alone, in a stranger's cabin, with nothing but the shame of knowing she was worth less than a rusted rifle. As she finally drifted into a restless, haunted sleep, she didn't know that the rifle was the key. She didn't know that her father hadn't just traded her away. He had made the biggest mistake of his life, and Luther Cross knew it. Morning light filtered through a frosted window, pale and gray. For a single, blissful second, Junior forgot. She was just a girl waking up. Then the memory crashed down on her, a physical weight that stole her breath. The wagon, the man, the rifle. She sat up, still wrapped in Luther's heavy coat, and that's when she heard it. A cough. It was a sick sound, wet and ragged. It came from the main room of the cabin. But it wasn't Luther. It was followed by another smaller cough, and then a soft whimper. It wasn't one person. It sounded like several. Hesitantly, she pushed open her door and peered out. The main room was bathed in the weak morning sun, and what she saw made her freeze in the doorway. Spread out on pallets around the warm stone hearth were children, 6 of them. They were a patchwork of faces and ages. A small boy with skin as dark as midnight, a girl with the sharp cheekbones and raven hair of the Lakota. Others looked like a mix of everything, their faces telling stories of families torn apart. All of them looked sick. Their faces were flushed with fever, their breathing shallow and ragged. Luther was by the fire, stirring a large pot that sent up a bitter, medicinal steam. He looked up as the floorboard creaked under her foot and gave that same small, barely there nod. He didn't offer an explanation. He just ladled the steaming broth into a wooden bowl and held it out to her. The message was clear. Help. She took the bowl, her hands trembling slightly. The closest child, a boy of about 8, fluttered his eyes open. They were glassy with fever. "Are you the new one?" he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Junior didn't know what to say, so she just shook her head. She knelt down, slipping an arm behind his small, burning shoulders, and helped him sip the broth. His skin felt like fire against hers. She moved from one pallet to the next, Luther working silently beside her. They were a team, wordlessly tending to the small, sick bodies. A girl with bright red hair, a boy who couldn't have been more than 5. They were all so weak. When they finished, Luther took a basket and a knife and headed for the door. He paused, pointed to a bucket of fresh water and a stack of clean rags, then stepped out into the snow. He didn't need to give an order. She knew what she had to do. The day passed in a blur of wiping brows, changing sweat-soaked blankets, and coaxing sips of water between small, cracked lips. The work was hard, exhausting, but it was a strange comfort. It kept the terrible thoughts at bay. It gave her a purpose beyond her own pain. Through the window, she could see Luther moving along the tree line, his big frame bent over as he gathered herbs and roots from beneath the snow. He wasn't just a mountain man. He was a healer. That evening, as the last of the light faded from the sky, she finally found her voice. The question had been burning in her all day. Why did you take me? Luther stopped stirring the pot of evening mush and turned to face her. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face, as if seeing something more than just a girl her father had thrown away. Knew your mother, he said, his voice a low rumble. Her name was Wea. The name hit Junior like a physical blow. Her father had forbidden it to be spoken in their house. It was a name from a part of her life she barely remembered, a life before the bitterness and the silence. I was tracking a buck years back, Luther went on, his gaze distant. Got caught in a freak blizzard. Broke my leg. Would have died out there. She found me. He paused. She was a healer, knew the old ways, knew what plants to use, how to set a bone. She saved my life. Junior sat frozen, hanging on every word. This was a story she'd never heard, a piece of her mother she'd never known. She made me promise, Luther said, his voice softer now. She said your father had a darkness in him. She was afraid for you. She made me promise that if anything ever happened to her, I'd look out for you. He looked down at his big calloused hands. Word reached me that she passed. Took me a while to track down where Tom had taken you. When I heard he was heading this way, I knew why. Tears welled in Junior's eyes, blurring the firelight. He hadn't bought her. He had been rescuing her. The deal with the rifle, it was all a show for her father, a way to get her away from him without a fight. Your mother, Luther continued, his voice thick with memory, she had a gift, a gentle way with things that were hurting. He looked over at the sleeping children, then back at Junior. You have it too. I saw it today. He stood up and walked over to a heavy wooden chest in the corner. He lifted the lid and the scent of dried herbs and old leather filled the room. He reached inside and pulled something out. It was the rifle, the one her father had traded her for. Tom Lark is a fool, Luther said, his voice flat. He thinks this is just a rusted old gun. He held it out to her. Junior took it, surprised by its weight. It looked worthless. But then Luther reached out and twisted the metal butt plate at the end of the stock. It came loose with a soft click. It wasn't solid. It was a cap. And inside, tucked into a hollowed-out space, was a small, rolled-up piece of oilskin. Her fingers trembled as she took it and slowly, carefully unrolled it. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't money. It was a map, a hand-drawn map of the very land they were on. It showed the hollow, the trees, the stream. And in the center, marked with a star, were the words, "The Mother Spring." Beside it, in her mother's elegant script, was a signature. And below that, stamped with an official-looking seal, was the signature of a territorial judge. It's a deed, Luther said quietly, legally filed and recorded. Your mother's people had treaty rights to this land for generations. She made sure it was protected. This land, this hollow, the spring, it doesn't belong to me. He looked directly at her, his eyes holding a truth so staggering it shook her to her core. It belongs to you. The world tilted again, but this time it wasn't from shame or fear. It was from a revelation so immense it felt like the mountain itself was shifting beneath her feet. She hadn't been sold. She'd been brought home. Her father hadn't gotten rid of her. He had unknowingly delivered her to her own inheritance. But as she stared at the map, a cold dread began to creep in. If her father was a fool for not knowing what was in the rifle, what would he do if he ever found out? He hadn't just given up a daughter he didn't want. He had given up a fortune. And a man like Tom Lark would never let that go. Never. For the next 2 days, the cabin became Junior's whole world. The shock of the land deeds slowly gave way to a quiet, powerful sense of purpose. This wasn't just Luther's sanctuary. It was her sanctuary. The children weren't just his wards. They were under her protection. A routine formed as naturally as the creek freezing over. Mornings were for tending to the sick. Their fevers were breaking, their coughs lessening. Luther's herbal broth seemed to work a slow magic, and Junior's steady presence seemed to be a medicine of its own. Little Nellie, a girl of about 6 with eyes as big and dark as a forest at midnight, had attached herself to Junior's shadow. She never spoke, but she was a constant, warm presence at Junior's side. handing her rags, stirring the pot when Junior's arms got tired, her small hand often finding its way into Junior's. One evening as she tucked the quilts around the sleeping children, a song surfaced from the deep well of her memory. It was a lullaby her mother used to sing, the Cherokee words feeling both foreign and familiar on her tongue. She sang it softly, her voice barely a whisper. The restless children grew still. The fire seemed to hush. Even Luther, mending a harness by the hearth, paused his work, his head bowed as he listened. The next day a new person appeared out of the woods. He was a young man, not much older than Junior, tall and lean, with the quiet grace of a deer. A long, puckered burn scar ran down the side of his face and neck. "This is Tall Elk," Luther said by way of introduction. "He helps." Tall Elk gave Junior a respectful nod, but said nothing. He carried a satchel filled with medicinal barks and fungi, which he and Luther sorted with the practiced ease of men who had done it 100 times before. Later, while Luther was outside, Tall Elk shyly showed Junior a leather-bound notebook. Inside were the most incredible drawings of plants and flowers, each one labeled in both English and Arapaho. "My grandmother taught me," he said, his voice soft, pointing to a sketch of a purple coneflower. "For fevers." A silent friendship began to form between them, built on shared tasks and mutual respect. He showed her which barks to peel for tea, and she taught him the words to her mother's lullaby. The hollow didn't feel so lonely anymore. One night after the children were asleep, Luther pulled a small tin box from a high shelf. "More you should know about your mother," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. He opened it. Inside was a hand-carved wooden comb, a faded photograph of a smiling young woman who had Junior's eyes, in a small beaded pouch. "She was a leader," Luther said, his voice thick with memory. "A knowledge keeper. People came from all over to be healed by her. She knew the power of the mother spring." He looked at Junior, his eyes serious. "That spring isn't just water, girl. It has a healing quality. It's why these children are getting better so fast. It's why this hollow has always been a sanctuary." He explained that the children he'd taken in weren't just random orphans. They were all outcasts, like her. Children of mixed blood, children with sicknesses, children abandoned because they were different. Luther had sought them out, bringing them to the one place he knew they could be healed and safe. Her mother's land, a legacy, a birthright. The weight of it was immense, but for the first time in her life, Junior felt strong, like she was part of something bigger than herself. But the mountain had other secrets. The first big snow came, a blizzard that buried the world in a blanket of white, isolating them completely. For a week, they were a tiny island of warmth and light in a sea of howling wind. The trail down the mountain vanished. They were utterly alone. It was during this time that Luther made his decision. "The circuit judge comes to Lander twice a year," he announced one evening, spreading a map on the table. "I'm going to him. I'm filing adoption papers for all of you." He looked from child to child, his gaze finally resting on Junior. "We're going to make this a legal family. Protect this place. Protect all of you from men like your father." He tapped the map. "I'll have to leave you and Tall Elk in charge. It's a 5-day ride in good weather. In this," he shook his head, "it could be longer. Can you handle it?" Junior looked at Tall Elk, who gave a firm, confident nod. She looked at the children, their faces turned up to her, full of trust. She thought of the deed, of her mother, of the healing spring. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We can." The morning Luther left, the air was sharp and still. He packed the deed and the carefully written adoption petitions into his saddlebags. He gave Junior a long, steady look. "Keep the fire hot and the children safe," he said. It was the closest he'd ever come to saying, "Be careful." She and Tall Elk stood by the cabin, watching him ride out until his form was swallowed by the endless white of the snow-covered forest. The silence he left behind was deafening. The first 2 days were quiet. They fell into a rhythm. Junior managed the cabin, the food, the children. Tall Elk managed the outdoors, the woodpile, the spring, checking it every day to make sure the flow wasn't freezing over. They were a good team. The children were almost completely recovered, their laughter starting to fill the small cabin. For the first time, Junior allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope, a flicker of peace. It was a mistake. On the third morning, the sound of hoofbeats shattered the winter silence. Not one horse, several, and they were coming fast. Junior's heart leaped into her throat. She ran to the window, wiping the frost away with the sleeve of her dress. 3 riders were emerging from the trees, their horses churning through the deep snow. The man in the lead was Tom Lark, and his face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He wasn't alone. Behind him were 2 other men, hard-faced and carrying rifles. They didn't look like deputies. They looked like wolves. "Get your things, girl!" Tom's voice boomed across the snow, a raw, ugly sound. "You're coming with me!" He swung down from his horse before it even stopped, stomping toward the cabin. The door flew open with a crash, and he filled the space, bringing the cold and the threat of violence in with him. The 2 men followed, their eyes scanning the cabin, taking in the children who were now huddled in a terrified cluster behind Junior. "What are you doing here?" Junior demanded, her voice shaking but defiant. "I'm not going with you." "Oh, you are," Tom snarled. He waved a piece of paper in his hand. "Got a court order here. Says you were taken against your will. Says you're my property." "That's a lie," she shot back. "You sold me for a rifle." One of the other men laughed, a greasy, unpleasant sound. "Ain't what the paper says, little lady. It says this Luther Cross fella is wanted for kidnapping and for running this illegal orphanage." He gestured at the children. "The law wants these strays rounded up too. Put in a proper institution." This was a nightmare. This couldn't be happening. Luther had gone to make them a legal family, and now her father was here to tear it all apart with a piece of paper that had to be a lie. "Where is he?" Tom demanded, his eyes darting around the room. "Where's Cross hiding?" "He's not here," Junior said, standing her ground, trying to shield the children with her body. Tom's eyes narrowed. He took a step forward, and his gaze fell on the small tin box sitting on the mantel, the one where Luther had kept her mother's things. With a sweep of his arm, he knocked it to the floor. The contents scattered across the wooden planks, the comb, the photo, the beaded pouch. His eyes landed on the faded photograph of Wea. A flicker of something, pain, anger, regret, crossed his face before it hardened back into a mask of greed. "Always thought she was hiding something up here," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He started tearing the cabin apart, his men joining in, yanking quilts off the beds, kicking over pots, throwing Luther's carefully organized herbs everywhere. "Stop it!" Junior cried. "This is my home." "This is nothing," Tom roared, whirling on her. "This is a squatter's shack on land that should have been mine." Suddenly, Tall Elk was there, appearing in the doorway from his morning check of the spring. He took in the scene, the terrified children, the ransacked cabin, Tom Lark's furious face. "You need to leave," Tall Elk said, his voice low and steady. One of the hired guns turned and, without a word, slammed his fist into Tall Elk's face. The boy crumpled to the floor, a dark trickle of blood running from the corner of his mouth. "No!" Junior screamed, a blind rage washing over her. She flew at the man, beating at his chest with her fists. It was like hitting a stone wall. He just laughed and shoved her back, sending her stumbling into the table. Tom grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in like talons. "Enough of this. You've caused enough trouble." He started dragging her toward the door. "The deed," Junior gasped, desperation making her reckless. "It won't matter. I have the deed. This is my land, legally. My mother's land." The 3 men stopped. They all turned to look at her. A heavy, dangerous silence fell over the room. Tom's grip on her arm tightened until she cried out in pain. His face was inches from hers, his eyes burning with a terrifying light. "What did you say?" She had made a terrible mistake. She had thought the deed was a shield, but she had just revealed to the wolf that he wasn't just chasing a sheep. He was chasing a treasure. "The rifle," he whispered, a sick, dawning comprehension spreading across his face. "That old piece of junk. It was in the rifle, wasn't it? That witch. She hid it in the rifle." He threw his head back and laughed, a horrifying, triumphant sound that echoed in the small cabin. "I knew it. I knew she had something valuable up here. His eyes glittered with a feverish greed. He wasn't just here for a daughter he could put to work. He was here for the land, for the spring, for everything. You're not going anywhere, girl, he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl as he shoved her toward one of his men. Not until you show me exactly what's on that deed. He turned to his other man. Tie up the boy. The rest of these runts, lock 'em in that back room. They'll keep quiet. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Junior. Luther was gone. They were trapped. Her one piece of power, the knowledge of the deed, had just become her greatest liability. The men worked quickly and brutally. Tall Elk, dazed and bleeding, was bound with rope and thrown into a corner. The other children, crying and screaming, were herded into Junior's small bedroom. The heavy wooden bar dropped across the outside of the door. Now, Tom said, turning back to her, his smile cruel, let's talk about my new property. He didn't know Luther had the deed with him. He thought it was hidden somewhere in the cabin. The search began again, but this time it was more frantic, more violent. They ripped open the mattresses, tore up floorboards, smashed the few pieces of crockery they had. Junior watched, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every second they spent searching was a second they weren't hurting anyone. But it wouldn't last. It's not here, one of the men finally yelled in frustration, kicking a stool across the room. Tom's eyes swiveled back to Junior. Then where is it? Did Cross take it with him? She refused to answer, pressing her lips together in a thin, tight line. Doesn't matter, Tom sneered. When he comes back, we'll be waiting for him. And in the meantime, his eyes drifted to the window, toward the path that led up to the spring. You can give us a tour. He grabbed her again, dragging her out of the cabin and into the biting cold. The snow was deep, and she stumbled, but his grip was iron. The other man followed close behind, his rifle at the ready. The path to the spring was quiet, the snow absorbing all sound. The only thing she could hear was her own ragged breathing and the thumping of her heart. This was her mother's sacred place, and this vile man was about to defile it. The spring was nestled in a small grotto, surrounded by ancient moss-covered rocks. Even in the deep cold of winter, the water flowed freely, steaming in the frigid air. It pooled in a shallow basin of smooth, dark stone before trickling down the mountain. So this is it, Tom said, his voice filled with avarice. He knelt down and dipped a hand in the water. It's warm. He brought his hand to his lips. A look of surprise crossed his face. It's sweet. He looked up at Junior, a plan clearly forming behind his greedy eyes. Water like this? The railroad would pay a fortune for it. A private pipeline, a resort for rich folks with consumption. He was dreaming out loud, his fantasies of wealth making him ugly. You can't, Junior whispered. This is a place of healing. It's for everyone. It's for whoever owns the land, he corrected her, standing up. And that's going to be me. He turned to his man. No sign of Cross yet. Let's head back. We'll board this place up. When he gets back, he'll have no choice but to deal. As he turned, his boot slipped on an icy patch of rock. He flailed, his arms pinwheeling, and then he fell. He fell hard. There was a sickening crack, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet grotto. It was the sound of bone breaking. Tom Lark let out a scream of agony, a raw, animal sound of pain. He clutched his leg, his face turning pale with shock. The bone had snapped just above the ankle, and it was already swelling, a grotesque bulge beneath his trousers. The hired man rushed to his side, but it was clear the leg was badly broken. Tom couldn't put any weight on it. He couldn't walk. He was trapped on the very land he was trying to steal. And suddenly the power had shifted. The hired gun, a man named Jeb, was panicking. He looked from Tom's twisted leg to Junior, then back again. What do we do? We can't carry him all the way down the mountain in this snow. The cabin, Tom gasped through gritted teeth, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. Get me back to the damn cabin. It was a slow, agonizing process. Jeb practically had to carry Tom, who screamed and cursed with every painful jolt. Junior walked behind them, her mind racing. This was a chance. A terrible, unexpected chance. Back in the cabin, they laid Tom on one of the pallets near the fire. He was shivering now, his face a pasty gray. Jeb looked at Junior, his own bravado gone, replaced by a desperate uncertainty. "You know about healing," he said. It wasn't a question. "That mountain man, he must have taught you things." "I know some things," Junior said carefully, her voice steady. "Then fix him," Jeb demanded. "I can't fix a break like that," she said truthfully. "It needs to be set properly by a doctor. All I can do is try to keep the swelling down and fight off any fever." She went to the scattered herbs on the floor, her heart pounding. She picked out willow bark for the pain and fever, and yarrow to help stop any bleeding. Her hands were shaking as she started crushing them to make a poultice. This was her mother's knowledge, and she was about to use it on the man who hated her for it. The other hired man, the one who had tied up Tall Elk, was growing nervous. "This is bad, Tom. Real bad. If that cross fella comes back and finds you like this—" "He won't be a problem," Tom snarled, his voice tight with pain. He pointed a trembling finger at Junior. "She'll keep me alive. And you too. You're gonna stand guard. The second cross shows his face, you shoot him. No questions." The two men exchanged a look. Their confidence was gone. They were hired for a simple land grab, not a potential murder, in a long winter trapped on a mountain with an injured man. Night fell. The wind began to howl outside, whipping snow against the windows. Junior tended to her father, cleaning the wound as best she could and applying the poultice. He had passed out from the pain, his breathing shallow. She worked silently, the two hired guns watching her every move, their rifles never far from their hands. She was their prisoner, but she was also their only hope. Late that night, she heard a soft scratching sound from the back room where the children were locked. She managed to convince Jeb to let her bring them some food and water. As she passed the bowl through a crack in the door, a small hand pressed a piece of charcoal into her palm. It was William, the oldest boy. He had been scratching a message on a piece of floorboard. Window, loose board. Her heart leaped. There was a way out. But what could they do? Where could they go? They were a group of children in the middle of a blizzard, with two armed men in the next room. Then she looked over at Tall Elk, still bound in the corner. He had been watching her, his eyes intelligent and alert despite the bruise on his face. He saw her look at the charcoal in her hand and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod toward the woodpile stacked by the hearth. An idea sparked in her mind, a dangerous, terrifying idea. The fire was the heart of the cabin. It was their only source of heat. The chimney was made of stone and mortar, solid and old. But the roof around it was made of dry timber and shingles. She had to create a diversion, something big enough to get the children out, something chaotic enough to let her free Tall Elk. She spent the next hour acting the part of the dutiful nurse, tending to her father, bringing the men cups of hot, bitter tea made from herbs she knew would make them drowsy, not suspicious. As their eyelids began to droop, she moved to the hearth, pretending to stoke the fire for the night. Her hands were shaking. If this went wrong, they would all die. She grabbed the poker, its iron tip glowing red hot from the embers. She took a deep breath. Then with all her strength, she jammed it up the chimney flue, dislodging a chunk of soot and creosote that had built up over years. It fell into the roaring fire below with a great whoosh. A plume of oily black smoke and a shower of bright orange sparks billowed out into the room. "What the hell?" Jeb shouted, jumping to his feet, rubbing his sleeping eyes. But it was too late. One of the larger sparks, carried by the plume of smoke, landed on the dry wooden mantel. In a second, it caught. A small tongue of orange flame began to lick its way up the wall. "Fire!" Junior screamed, kicking over the water bucket, making it look like an accident. "The roof is on fire!" Chaos erupted. The two men, groggy from the tea and panicked by the flames, were disoriented. In that moment of confusion, Junior darted over to Tall Elk, pulling a small skinning knife she had hidden in her dress. With two quick slashes, she cut the ropes that bound his hands and feet. "The children!" she hissed. "Get them out the window!" Tall Elk didn't hesitate. He was a shadow moving silently to the back room, pulling away the loose board William had told them about. The fire was spreading now, smoke filling the cabin, thick and choking. Jeb and the other man were trying to beat out the flames with a blanket, but they were only making it worse. Tom Lark was screaming from his pallet, a mixture of pain and terror. "Get me out of here! Don't leave me!" Junior saw her chance. While the men were distracted, she grabbed the one thing that mattered most, the small tin box containing her mother's things. She shoved it inside her dress and ran for the back room. Tall Elk was already pushing the last of the children, little Nellie, through the small opening and into the snow outside. "Go!" he urged Junior. "I'll hold them off." He grabbed a heavy piece of firewood, his face grim and determined. Junior scrambled through the window, tumbling out into the freezing snow-filled night. The children were huddled together, their faces white with fear in the flickering orange glow of the burning cabin. She gathered them close. "Run for the trees!" she yelled over the roar of the fire and the howling wind. "Stay together!" They plunged into the darkness of the forest just as a gunshot rang out from the cabin. They didn't look back. They just ran. A desperate, terrified family of orphans led by a girl who had just declared war. The blizzard raged around them, the fire behind them, and unknown dangers ahead. They were free, but they were also hopelessly lost. The forest was a nightmare of tangled branches and deep, clinging snow. The wind screamed through the pines, ripping away their body heat, trying to freeze them where they stood. The light from the burning cabin was quickly swallowed by the blizzard, plunging them into an almost total darkness. Junior held little Nellie in her arms, her own body shielding the small girl from the worst of the wind. The other children struggled behind her, their small legs sinking deep into the drifts. William, the oldest, helped the others, his face a grim mask of determination. They had no idea where they were going. All Junior knew was they had to get away from the cabin, away from the gunshots. "This way!" A voice cut through the storm. It was Tall Elk. He had appeared beside them as silently as a ghost, a dark shape against the swirling snow. He must have escaped right after them. "There's a hunter's lean-to," he said, his voice tight against the cold. "Not far. My grandfather built it. We can shelter there." He took the lead, breaking a trail through the untouched snow, his knowledge of the forest their only guide. It was a brutal journey. The cold was relentless. The children were crying, their strength fading. Junior's hope began to fray. They had escaped the fire only to die in the ice. Finally, Tall Elk stopped. Ahead was a rock outcropping, and tucked beneath it, almost invisible in the snow, was a simple three-sided shelter of logs and pine boughs. It wasn't much, but it was out of the wind. They collapsed inside, huddling together for warmth on the frozen ground. They had no fire, no food, no blankets. All they had was each other. "They'll come for us, Sarah," one of the older girls whispered, her teeth chattering. "Let them," Tall Elk said, his voice hard as iron. "They don't know this mountain. We do." As the night wore on, the true cost of their escape became clear. Little Nellie's breathing became shallow and ragged. She was burning with fever. The shock and the cold had been too much for her small body. Junior held her close, trying to share her own body heat, rocking her gently and humming her mother's lullaby. Panic clawed at her throat. She had saved them from her father, but what if she couldn't save them from the mountain? She needed medicine. She needed warmth. She needed the spring. As dawn broke, a grim gray light filtering through the snow-filled trees, a decision was made. They couldn't stay there. Nellie wouldn't last another day. "I have to go back," Junior said. Tall Elk looked at her, his dark eyes filled with concern. "It's too dangerous. They'll be looking for you." "I'm not going to the cabin," she said. "I'm going to the spring. The water, it can help her. I know it can." She looked at him, her gaze pleading. "I need to get some herbs, too. There are some that grow near the rocks there, even in winter." It was a desperate gamble. Her father and his men would surely be searching the area. But looking at Nellie's pale, still face, Junior knew it was a risk she had to take. "I'll go with you," Tall Elk said immediately. "The rest of you," he said, looking at the other children, "stay here. Stay hidden. Do not make a sound." They moved through the forest like wraiths, using the trees and rocks for cover, their senses on high alert. The snow had finally stopped, and the world was eerily quiet. As they drew closer to the area around the spring, they saw tracks, 3 sets, 2 men walking, and a third being dragged. They had abandoned the cabin. It must have been too damaged by the fire. They were probably camped somewhere nearby, waiting. Junior's heart hammered against her ribs. They reached the edge of the grotto, hiding behind a thicket of snow-laden firs. They could see the spring, steaming in the cold morning air. And they could see the camp. It was just below the spring. Her father's men had made a crude shelter. Tom Lark was lying near a small, smoky fire, wrapped in blankets. One of the men, Jeb, was sitting guard, his rifle across his knees. The other man was gone, probably hunting or scouting. This was their only chance. "I'll create a diversion," Tall Elk whispered, his eyes scanning the layout of the camp. "Downwind. I can make them think it's a bear or an elk. It will draw the guard away from the fire. When he's gone, you run for the spring. Be fast." Before Junior could object, he was gone, melting back into the trees. She waited, her body tense, every nerve screaming. It felt like an eternity. Then from the woods to the south of the camp came a sound, a deep, guttural grunt, followed by the crashing of branches. Jeb shot to his feet, his rifle raised. "What was that?" "Probably just a moose," Tom Lark grumbled from his bed of blankets. "Sounded bigger," Jeb said, his eyes nervously scanning the trees. The sound came again, closer this time. "I'm going to check it out. Don't want a grizzly wandering into camp." He moved off into the woods, his boots crunching in the snow. Now, Junior bolted from her hiding place. She ran, her feet flying over the snow, her lungs burning from the cold air. She didn't dare look at her father. She focused only on the steaming pool of the mother spring. She had a small water skin she'd grabbed from the cabin. She plunged it into the warm, healing water, her fingers numb from the cold. She grabbed a handful of the tough, winter herbs growing in the crevices of the warm, damp rocks around the pool. She had it. She turned to run back. And froze. Her father was sitting up. His face was a mask of pain and fury. And in his hand, he was holding a pistol she hadn't known he had. "Going somewhere, girl?" he rasped, the gun shaking in his hand. She was trapped. The trees were too far away. He was between her and any hope of escape. "Give me the deed," he demanded, his voice weak but filled with venom. "I know Cross doesn't have it. It must be on you." She clutched the precious tin box hidden under her coat. He thought she had the deed itself. "It's over, Father," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. "Luther will be back. The law will be with him." "The law?" He let out a harsh, barking laugh that turned into a cough. "I am the law up here. Now give it to me." From the woods, a single sharp whistle cut through the air, a signal from Tall Elk. Jeb must be on his way back. She had to make a choice. She looked at her father, this pathetic, greedy man, broken and consumed by his own hate. She looked at the pistol in his hand, and she looked at the steep, rocky slope behind the spring. She made her decision. "You want it?" she yelled, pulling the tin box from her coat and holding it up. "Then come and get it." And with that, she turned and scrambled up the slick, mossy rocks behind the spring, away from the camp, away from the path, toward the high, treacherous ridges above. "Get her!" Tom screamed just as Jeb came running back into the camp. "She's got the deed. Don't let her get away." Jeb didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle, took aim, and fired. The shot echoed through the mountains like a crack of thunder. The bullet didn't hit her. It slammed into the rock just beside her head, showering her with chips of stone and ice. But the shock of it made her lose her footing. She slipped, her hands scrabbling for a hold on the icy surface, and she tumbled back down, landing hard in the snow at the edge of the grotto, the tin box flying from her grasp. Jeb was on her in a second, the muzzle of his rifle pressed against her cheek. The metal was so cold it burned. "Gotcha," he grunted, a cruel smile on his face. He picked up the tin box and handed it to Tom, who had crawled closer. With trembling, greedy fingers, Tom fumbled with the latch and opened it. He tipped the contents onto the snow. The comb, the photograph, the beaded pouch. But no deed. His face contorted with rage. "Where is it?" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Where is the deed?" "I told you," a new voice said, a low, rumbling voice that cut through the tension like a razor. "I have it." Everyone froze. Standing at the edge of the gentry, his horse behind him, was Luther Cross. He looked bigger than the mountain itself, his face grim, his eyes chips of ice. And he wasn't alone. Beside him stood another man, wearing the badge of a U.S. Marshal. "Tom Lark," the Marshal said, his voice carrying the cold authority of the law. "You're under arrest for kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder." Jeb spun around, raising his rifle, but he was too slow. A shot rang out, not from the Marshal, but from the trees. Jeb cried out and collapsed, clutching his shoulder, his rifle falling into the snow. Tall Elk stepped out from behind a pine, a bow in his hand, an arrow nocked and ready. It was over. The second hired gun, who had been out scouting, surrendered without a fight when he saw the Marshal. Tom Lark, broken and defeated, could only curse and spit as they splinted his leg and bound his hands. Luther came to Junior's side, his big hand resting on her shoulder. "You're safe now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Tears streamed down her face, tears of relief, of exhaustion, of overwhelming gratitude. "Nellie," she whispered, remembering. "She's sick." Within the hour, they were all back at the lean-to. Luther, using the herbs and the spring water Junior had gathered, tended to Nellie, his touch gentle and sure. The Marshal, a man named Roberts, listened intently as Junior and Tall Elk told him everything that had happened. "We got your letter, Mr. Cross," Marshal Roberts said to Luther. "The judge sent me up here to investigate your claims. Looks like I got here just in time." He looked at the huddled group of children. "And to deliver this." He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope. Inside was a stack of official documents, each bearing the seal of the Wyoming Territory. The adoption papers, all of them signed and approved. They were a family, legally, officially, forever. But there was one last piece of justice to be delivered. As they led Tom Lark and his men away, her father turned to look at her one last time. There was no remorse in his eyes, only a deep, burning hatred. "You'll never be anything but her daughter," he spat, the words meant as a final curse. "A dark, half-wild thing." Junior looked at him, at the man who had caused her so much pain, and for the first time, she felt nothing but a strange, hollow pity. She thought of her mother, of her strength, her knowledge, her legacy of healing. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong, echoing in the cold mountain air. "I am." She was her mother's daughter, and she was finally, truly home. The spring that followed was one of rebirth. With Tom Lark and his men gone, a sense of peace settled over Sanctuary Hollow. Marshal Roberts made sure the world below knew that the land and the children on it were legally protected. The story of the greedy father and the daughter he'd underestimated became a local legend. Junior, Luther, and Tall Elk rebuilt the cabin, making it stronger and warmer than before. The children, now legally Luther's sons and daughters, and Junior's brothers and sisters, flourished. Their laughter replaced the sounds of coughing, filling the hollow with a music it hadn't heard in a long time. Junior became the keeper of the spring, just as her mother had been. She studied Tall Elk's drawings and learned the names and uses of every plant in the forest. She filled her own journal with her mother's stories, with the children's drawings, with the steady, quiet rhythm of their new life. She found her voice not in speaking, but in healing, in caring, in building a home for the unwanted, a sanctuary for the lost. She was no longer the girl sold for a rusted rifle. She was Junior Berk Lark Cross, guardian of the Mother Spring, a healer, a sister, a survivor. She carried the strength of mountains in her blood, and she had finally learned how to use it. The world can be a cold, hard place. It can try to tell you what you're worth, try to put a price on your soul. But as Junior learned, your value isn't determined by those who cast you aside. It's forged in the promises you keep, the family you choose, and the courage you find to claim your own birthright. If you believe in the power of resilience and the strength of a chosen family, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Every story we share here is a reminder that even in the deepest, coldest winter, the promise of spring is always waiting. Thanks for watching.